Hello, I'm Kate Tilton, founder of Kate Tilton's Author Services LLC, where I help authors upscale their businesses. Today, I'm so pleased to have Dan Blank, founder of We Grow Media, with us today to talk about his new book, Be the Gateway, a practical guide to sharing your creative work and engaging an audience. A perfect tool for any author's toolbox. Hi, Dan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to catch up.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. I've already pre-ordered my copy of your debut book.
Thank
So,
you.
can you tell us a bit about the book and why you wrote it?
Yeah. So this book, in some ways, it feels like a long time coming. So I've had my little company for 6 years now, and I work with authors and creative professionals. And with what I do, I'm in the trenches with them. These are people who are launching books. They're early career, mid career, late career. And what goes on here is this idea of how do you frame your creative work in a way that is engaging to an audience. So last year, I work with this mastermind group and I do videos for them. And um, offhand, I did this video called Be the Gateway. And it sort of outlined this whole process of instead of viewing your work as a product that's a marketplace, of really thinking about what you're creating for people in a different way. The way I talk about it in the book is this idea that a lot of people frame their success around what I call objects, tokens, or metrics. So it's about how many followers they have, or if they've hit somewhere on a bestseller list, or if they receive an award or a review. And what I find after working with so many authors who are mid-career and later is how hollow those things are. So this whole book is about how do you engage an audience in a way that feels meaningful, where it feels fulfilling and it feels like you are actually affecting other people's lives, not just putting a product out into the marketplace.
I love that concept. I think we both do kind of similar work. We're in the trenches working with authors, and it really is. I hear authors who they're told so frequently, like, you need to be on all these social media sites, and it's numbers, numbers, numbers. But at the end of the day, like, if you don't have an engaged audience and you're not doing fulfilling work, then what does it matter? Um, it's one of those things too where, it's easy to get hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, but if those people aren't engaged and they're not really your true audience, like, what's the point? So,
Yeah, I often think about it in two ways, which is when we think about the actual work, the actual books, whether it's a novel or a memoir, nonfiction book, of really thinking about what do you want the impact of that to be on someone's life. Really thinking about the idea of you want them to buy it and read it, but more than that, you want them to think about that character 4 years later when they're going through a difficult time in their life. You want, if it's a nonfiction book or a memoir, you want them to have had an insight from you that they always think back on. And again, that's, I think, the distinction between the idea of just going for followers or that kind of short-term rush that doesn't really have depth versus really thinking about, I've created this book and this is how it can really shape someone's life. So it's a little bit of a different way of looking at it, but I agree. I love that you look at it that way as well.
yeah. So, one of the questions I had for you is, how does that book help accomplish this kind of mind shift from thinking about just numbers and that kind of success into thinking about, the real fulfillment of, like, being an author, but still hitting those marks of success? Because a lot of authors, they're running businesses, they still need to have sales. So how do we kind of balance that between just doing what we love to do and being successful?
So the way I broke up the book was in three sections. The first is the idea of building your gateway, and that's you really looking at who you are and what you want to create and what your creative work is. How do you best represent that? How do you really zoom in on what you're creating and why you're creating it, how you can share that? The second part is the idea of opening the gate, which is sort of really all about audience research. And I know you're really big into this, but I always feel like people just simply skip the audience research piece. They have an idea and they jump right to marketing or they jump right to social media. And then they get frustrated because they're like, I don't know who my audience is, or I don't know anything about them. And I think there's that big middle ground, the idea of, like, you've built this gateway, you're so clear about what you want to create and why, and kind of communicate that, and then really focusing on the people you want to reach and getting to know them one by one. And the last whole section is the idea of walking someone through the gate. And to me, it's this idea, there's a phrase in the book of don't go viral. And the idea there is not that I don't want you to have massive success. It's the idea that I think that there's so much to be gained when you understand what you're about, you understand your audience, and then you take the time one by one to really bring them through the gate, to really see how they experience your work and work like yours. And then that's the kind of thing that scales. I put a ton of step-by-steps in the book, a ton of examples. But I think that oftentimes you look at our heroes, our creative heroes, you'll see that example of how they went to that book reading and that book signing and they stayed there for 4 hours and they were talking to people. And all I think is, that's amazing. How come you can't do that when you have 15 followers or 15 fans? Like, why don't you treat those 15 fans like David Sedaris treats the 500 fans that show up to an event? Like, why is that so impossible? So that's what we focus on, a lot of step by step.
Yeah, and you're right. That's really like my jam. So a lot of authors that I work with consulting, right? We go into that kind of marketing, and sometimes the authors I meet, it's not that they don't, like, they understand the idea, but they've never been actually told. It's not something that we learn in school unless you go to a marketing course. So how do you actually, like, what is a target audience? Like, what does that term even mean? Because I find a lot of, gurus and stuff will throw those terms around with kind of broad overall, like, hey, yeah, you need to find out your target audience and then go on social media and reach them. But how do you do it? So that's one of the things that I'm really excited to hear that your book is about. It's one of the things I'm working on with my course. Because it's something that every time I talk to an author, like, that is what we talk about. It's, they come to me, they're like, I need help with social media. We always go back to, okay, well, who's your audience and who are you trying to reach?
Right.
Link decided he wanted to be in the video too. And then the second part of it is, you're right. Like, why don't we do things when we have smaller audiences? I'd rather have 100 really passionate fans who are my target audience, who I'm writing for or who I'm creating content for, than to have thousands of people who are just there because they thought it was cool to, like, follow me or something. Like, it's not a real connection.
Right.
And I think that's why, like, we get along so well, because we really believe in this idea of, let's nurture the audience, let's build real connections. So are there any tips you have for authors about, like, how they can build genuine connections that are about the connection versus what can I get out of it?
Yeah, definitely. There's so much. I'm trying to think of where to start.
I know. It's a big question.
So one thing I think would be the idea of becoming a student of your audience. So one, if you understand your work, you have to understand your work, how it fits in the marketplace. So one example I'll go through, one practice, is the idea of finding comps. So finding comparable work to what you do. And these comps have to be current. They've got to be things that have been the last couple of years. And they're never going to be exact. I've seen so many authors go through this and they reject every other book in the world because their book is a special snowflake. And I don't say that it isn't. I know that it is truly unique work that is from your heart. But it exists in a marketplace, and you want to engage an audience. And this audience has a worldview. They have a narrative that they tell in their head. So identifying what other books and movies and stories do they love. And when you do that, really looking at the other authors who write those, and really studying those people, looking at all of social media, not as a broadcast mechanism, but more as a research tool. So if you can find 5 comparable authors to what you do, and you can observe how they engage in online and social media, and more importantly, you can look at their audience. You can look at what people are saying to them. You can go on YouTube and look at book talks that they give at a bookstore or a library and see, well, what do people ask them? What do these people look like? You can go on Amazon and look at all the reviews and see the names of the people and see, how did they talk about this book? Why did those books resonate with them? It's almost like the reader is giving you a script about, why do they love books like this? What is it that just jumped out at them? What hit them and what didn't? And I find a lot of this process forces you to challenge your own assumptions. An example I give in the book, but I'll talk about here a little bit, is I worked with quite a few historical fiction authors. And it's interesting is that sometimes, they do all this research into real history. And so much what they uncover is truly fascinating. One thing that you will sometimes find, depending on what kind of novel it is and what kind of audience, is that, yes, They want the history to be there. And it's compelling, but it's not the main thing. And you can sometimes have an author say, the historical research I did is the main thing, and I use that to create these interesting characters. And the reader is like, look at how interesting these characters are. Oh, it's kind of cool. This is based on real history.
Yep.
Like when you look at the audience, you start understanding it from their point of view. And I think that that's one thing. I think baked into that process is the idea of developing colleagues. You should have colleagues. You should know other authors who write books that are vaguely similar to yours. You should be talking to librarians and booksellers and people who are broadly in this community supporting that, people who organize conferences. You don't call them because you want them to feature you. You call them, you email them, you connect with them because just like you said, Dan, you do similar work as me. We get along. We should probably be really good friends. And it's that same type of an ethos of you're going to learn from them just by observing them, just by knowing them. And I think with that, with both the idea of colleagues and of engaging with your audience, find some least crowded channels. I think the thing that always surprises me is how much people rely on social media and how they forget to use email. They forget to use the telephone. They forget to use Skype like we're talking on. They forget the fact that they can show up somewhere and have lunch with someone or show up to someone's meeting. These are such powerful tools. And most adults I know will bemoan how quick everything moves and social media. Oh, it's all these tweets. It's so stupid. And then you'll say, why don't you email that person? And why don't you have a conversation with them? And they're like, well, I don't know about that. It's because there's a lot of social fear involved, which I have a lot of empathy for. But I talk a lot about that in the book as well. That's a few ways I would talk about breaking into really identifying your audience and thinking about how does one engage with them.
I love both of these things. So when you talk about engaging the authors and our audience and comparable authors, that is something that I teach authors when I do one-on-one consulting. And we do the same thing. I'm like, find books that are comparable. And I have had authors who are like, well, my book is that special snowflake. It doesn't really fit in any genres. And I'm like, okay, maybe it doesn't fit in any particular genre category, but what's the heart of your story? Like, what are you trying to convey with your story? Is this a story about like coming of age? Is it about finding out who you are, your sexuality? Is it social justice? Is it just for entertainment purposes? Like, none of those are wrong, but what's the heart of your story? Because that will help you then find those comparable authors. Because you might say, well, this book isn't technically in this genre, but it has that same kind of feel. Like, I know someone who read that book is going to like reading my book as well. And that is a huge start into like the whole marketing thing. And we could literally talk about that forever. I wish I could, because I love talking about that kind of stuff. But on the second side of also finding out people that you can, build partnerships with and friendships with, I think are really important. One of the awesome things about this community, this industry, is that we're not all really quite in competition with each other. It's not like gasoline that's kind of the same no matter where you go, right? Like, we as authors or as people providing services for authors, we all have our special thing to offer. You might write a thriller book and this other person might write a thriller book, but reader's going to read more than one book in a year in most cases, right? So like, it's better to be partners with that other thriller author than to kind of fight against them. And I love that.
I always think about this as what kind of lifestyle do you want to lead? And in the 90s, I managed a cafe and I was very involved in the arts community. And what you saw back then, before the bigness of the internet, certainly before the social internet, was you saw this. You saw that someone who was a performer or an artist or musician or a writer, they showed up places. They had colleagues. They had peers. They went somewhere and they engaged with people because that was the only way to do it. And it wasn't just that's how you market work. It was the idea of this is how that person lives. They're a writer who engages with all these other thinkers and writers and have conversations with people who love the kind of stories that they do. And again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning about the idea of finding a fulfilling way to do this. I think that too often writers' approach is, well, there's the writing process, then you market, and then you run away because marketing is horrible. And it's
so
like,
scary.
Why don't we think about the lifestyle that you want to lead? as it relates to this work and how it lives, and then how you make that feel fulfilling. And that's kind of the way I like to think about all of this.
I love it too because I feel like having, colleagues or partners or just friends who are in the industry, like it makes us better people and it makes us better at, writing or producing products or just helping people. I mean, the core of my business has always been like, I like helping people. I also really like books. So the fact that I can help authors was just perfect. But I find that by like having conversations with people, having those relationships, like having an editor, if I have a blog post that I really want to get perfect and I send it to an editor, it's going to be a better blog post at the end of the day. I got a partner for my online courses because I decided, you know what, I could do it on my own, or I could partner with someone and make even better products in the end and help more people and reach more people. And so like, it's mutually beneficial for both of us, plus for everyone we're going to touch. So I love that kind of concept. And I love the idea that you brought up of actually like having phone calls, having Skype conversations, doing email, or just going in person. So I cannot tell you how many people I have as clients who I've met in person, or just relationships that I've built from meeting people in person. And I'm sure you have stories like that. Do you have any you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting thing about going through the publishing process is you really learn the value of what you just said, which is the value of partners. Whether you're designing a book cover or having it edited or someone format the book or someone who's helping to promote the book or even ideate with it, the idea of a developmental editor, someone who's inspiring you. You realize that the creative process is inherently a partnership, inherently a group effort. One thing that I've been involved with for a while now is having a mastermind group. And to me, a mastermind group is a way of having that kind of safe space with other creators. And I've been in all kinds of mastermind groups, from a one-on-one group to, 4 people to 10 people to 20 people. And it can be all different ways. And I find that it's a very powerful thing when you truly have a support group of peers where you're able to see other people do creative work, which can really help you out in those tough weeks when your kids are sick and something's going weird at work and life has just got you down. But it's also that you're not dangling out there by yourself. In the same way that you're finding a partner for the course, it's not that you can't do it on your own. I think that too often writers have this weird sentimental vision of going it alone because they're dreaming of J.K. Rowling sitting in a cafe writing the book. And what you realize is that the second that J.K., Miss Rowling had the chance to not be by herself in that cafe, she grabbed that chance to have partners. And to this day, she has a wide range of people she works with. So I think that's definitely, there's a lot of ways to do that. Masterminds are one way that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I love that kind of idea of a mastermind. So I've never been part of a mastermind before, which I feel like that needs to be corrected soon. I have like talked to a strategist before, and that was really interesting. It was someone that I met at a conference. So I went to Digital Commerce Summit, and I just decided, you know what, because I love the guys at Rainmaker Digital, like I'm going to go to this conference. I got the ticket for a good price. It's great. I didn't know the hotel was going to be that expensive, but it's already said and done. So I'm like, I'm going anyway. So not only did I end up meeting a really big, New York Times, USA Today bestselling author who decided to hire me because she was impressed that I was there. I also met the strategist who was like, hey, let's talk about these kind of things and let's barter our work, which helped me decide, you know what, yes, it's time for me to do the courses. It's time for me to let go of some things that, as much as I love doing, are not helping people in the way that I need them to be helping. It's huge. So huge change this year. I think that's kind of a big thing about 2017 is like people kind of struggled through 2016 and like 2017 people are saying, we're going to go for it. We're going to shake things up. We're going to do things that, people tell us not to do, and we're just going to go for it and make those kind of relationships. So I love that. And I really like, how like you're doing this. You're going from being someone who's been assisting authors and helping them through their path to actually taking that journey yourself. So you can talk a little bit about how you decided first to actually make that jump and how it's been to like be on the other side of it.
It's funny. This has been, I think, a long time coming because I grew up as an artist and I was a photographer and I did poetry and I was in bands and my whole life has been this creative stuff. I married an artist, so we have that in our house as well. When I first started doing the book, it was a different book than this. It was a book that I wanted to traditionally publish. And what I found was the expectations of that to get the great agent, to get the great publisher, to make it a book that would really matter, everything about that, it became so big. I ended up with this 85,000 word book, piles of research, and it just became too much to manage. And I just noticed it kept being put on the back burner because it was such a big project. And I was talking with a close friend earlier this year, and I really started thinking about, well, what would be, because I have to do this. I want to be writing more and publishing. And I really thought about, well, how do I work well? Well, I work well when I have a little more control. I'm very regimented in my schedule. And if I have total control, not that there's such a thing as control, but that perception of control, I work really well. And, I just started talking about ways of doing it. I could partner with people really well. So I just said, you know what, instead of doing a big, massive book, why don't I do a little book? And I'll self-publish it. We'll put it out there. I'll get some collaborators on it. We'll just do that. And just bringing it down to that level, a million great things happened. For one, I got on this great writing schedule. It became much easier to deal with a smaller concept. And in the end, I think it became a much better book. The book became much bigger than I expected. And it's been neat going through the process of writing, which was probably the easy part, but structuring it, writing it. Editing is so fascinating. I've had so many people work with me on editing this, from a very big way to copy editing, to proofreaders, to beta readers, all of that. That process is fascinating. And now we're at the publishing process where you're getting the digital files ready, deciding where you want to go. And what I've found is that at every step of the way, having boundaries helps. The biggest boundary for me is that my wife and I are having our second child in April. So I would say there's not a single decision about this book that has not been affected by that, because I had to decide, book's coming out in March because it has to come out before the baby's born. It means I've decided that the book is only coming out first on Amazon, not because that's my belief system or anything. It's because I don't have the time to figure out the wider distribution right now. I can get it up on Amazon, and later on, after the baby's born, I can kind of distribute it more widely. Every step of the way, that boundary has helped me. And for me, I think it's just fun it's sort of why, like you, I like working with authors who are really doing the work, is that it reminds you in the most personal, emotional way possible of what it means to create, what it means to put yourself out there, what it means to have empathy with your audience. And to me, it's just good to feel that on such a visceral, emotional level, and look at each of these little steps of the process, every little button on Amazon and Create Space, and to not view it as something that's scary, but to view it as this is a part of the process. I did a ton of artwork in the 90s, and back then it was similar. It just wasn't a digital button. I would have to take a train ride into New York City and then take a subway down to Pearl Paint and go up to the fourth floor and then go to the Pantone color marker aisle. And then I have to test out all the colors because they were $3.50 a pop. And then, it's like, and you have to get home and get the right kind of paper and all this stuff, like just to create one illustration. And it's that same thing, except now it's buttons on Amazon and Create Space. So it's fun to just be in that place of that visceral, emotional place of this is why we create.
I love that. And it's funny because your journey actually, it seems to like mirror my own with these courses, where it's like, I started out with this idea, a lot of people are doing courses, and I was like, oh, this sounds like something that I could do. I mean, I'm doing consulting already, so why not put that in course form? And originally it started out with, I'm going to do a social media course for authors, and it was going to be really, really big, and completely has changed over the years. I was like, one, as someone who's taken courses, sometimes they're just too large, there's too much to do, and talking with authors, working with authors, they don't have time to sit there and do a 3-month course. But could they put aside a weekend? Yes. So that's kind of where the idea started coming. Like, I should be doing smaller courses. They'll cost less. They'll be something that can be completed and an author could leave with something in hand. So I love that kind of, you're having those same shifts where like you start out with this huge thing and then you found out that, maybe smaller is better in this case, and having that kind of boundary in mind that like, hey, I have a due date now because baby is coming. And you've actually talked about this thing before, and kind of being able to set your work schedule and put boundaries. Like, I know that you don't do like a lot of plane travel, that kind of thing. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. Like, how do you decide what boundaries are good for you? Because I think that's important.
So this is actually, I forgot I actually put this in the book, but it's the idea that I'm very clear about my priorities. And to me, and this is for me alone, you know, my priority is to be there with my family, with my wife and my son, and now our new son that we're expecting. So everything about how my life is set up is to honor my family, to be there with my family, to physically be there, and to do right by my clients and writers. So for me, I don't fly at all. I don't fly, period. I don't fly for anything. So what that does is it means, great, I don't have to feel pressure to speak at a writing conference in California or to take a client who will need in person in Texas. It's off the table. And that means that it allows me to really think, okay, great, I'm going to work virtually with clients. How can I do that really well? Do a mastermind. Well, how do I do that really well virtually? I have a very regimented schedule because it works really well for me. We're in my home office now, but wake up every day around 5 a.m. I'm at my local Starbucks by 5:30. I work there for about 3 to 4 hours, and then I take a break. I take a 2-hour break in the middle of every single day because I believe in this aspect of you're doing this very specific mental work. You're on a screen, you're engaging, and then of having time away from that. I'm a huge believer in the power of taking a nap every day, and I've taken a nap every day for years and years and years and years and years. And I feel like there's stigmas attached to some of these things that aren't really necessary. That when you really think about what matters to you, about the people that I'm supporting, which are like my clients and my family, and really caring about your work, you start opening yourself up to, like, well, how can I do this more effectively? Even back when I had a day job at a big corporation, I pushed to work from home. And by the time that job ended after 10 years, I was working from home full time. And again, it was just really thinking about what works for me and what my goals are. I do not pretend that that works well for anyone else. I find that when I'm doing heavy duty writing, it works best if I do it first thing in the morning. And for me, that really works. The first hour of the day is writing. But that might not work for you. You might work better at 10 o'clock at night when everyone else is tuned off. I think the key, though, is to really understand, how do you work really well? What are your goals? And for a lot of writers, this is the underpinning of a lot of big decisions. Writers out there are saying, should I quit my job to double down my writing, or should I not? And I've heard great stories and bad stories both ways. And I think the key there is to really understand, what do you want? And then how do you work best? And how can you best attend to those things that you are really striving to live up to?
Yeah, and I would add to actually write that down. It's one of the things that I see, so not just authors, but also people who work with authors. It's this idea of, I think it's partly our culture, American culture, that like work is so important. Like, we glorify being busy. But when you really get down to it, I know so many people who are in business who for themselves, who have gotten sick because they work themselves to that breaking point. And I'm like, when it comes to me, I'm like thinking about my clients, I'm like, if I work myself to being ill, then I cannot help my clients anymore. So like, how does that end up working out in the long run? So, I've made boundaries, like I don't work on the weekends. It's one of those things where people look at me like, what do you mean you don't work on the weekends? Like, why don't you just do this on the, on the weekend? And I'm like, because I need that mental time. I work Monday through Friday. I work, 8 hours to 10 hours to more, depending on the day, but I don't work on the weekends. Like, that's my thing. But it takes time, and it's kind of scary to like take that step and say, like, this is what I'm going to do. And unfortunately for me, like, I can say that I'm not gonna work on the weekends. We talk about authors who have day jobs. Sometimes that's not in the cards. So I do like that, we're not saying that just because this is how I work or this is how Dan works, that this is how you have to work. You have to figure out what works for you.
I do think that there's a real inherent thing there, though, of questioning assumptions you have. And I can think back of when I did have a day job. I worked in Manhattan. It was a really good job, a really good company. And every day I took my lunch break and I left the office and I just went for walks and I got food every day. And I was one of the few people who did that. And it was one of those things where it felt like I was actually risking my job in the beginning. Because most people just ran downstairs, grabbed a crappy sandwich, and they ate at their desk. And it took 15 minutes. And I was thinking, like, we get an hour, right? Like, it's in the bylaws, like, it's there, we're allowed to do that, right? And we're in Manhattan. Like, you walk in a half hour in any direction and there's something wildly different. And there's all this great food here. It was sort of like, and for a writer, maybe it's not taking a walk, but maybe it is. Maybe you take a walk to clear your head, and because that inspires you. Maybe you go to a museum. Maybe you go to a library and write for 15 minutes. Maybe you sit in your car and do that. Maybe you listen to a podcast. There are these little moments. There's so much of your day that I know are uncontrollable. You have a family and you've got a job, you have responsibilities, health issues a lot of people work through. Yep. Find those little moments where you can feel like you're the author you want to be because you find those moments.
Yeah, I think that's so important too, is just like find what works for you, what your schedule is. You know, Dan, you are definitely a morning person. You get up at 5 a.m. If I got up at 5 a.m, I would be crying every day. You know, I'm like, it's 8 o'clock, my alarm goes off, and some days I say, no, I'm not getting up. I'm going to stay here for another hour, and then I'll get started later and I'll work a little bit later. And I love the fact that like what I do allows me that flexibility. Not everyone gets that. You know, I'm in that millennial generation, so I have my friends who are just like, yep, I'm here at work at this god-awful hour, and I hate it. And I'm like, I love that as creatives, we can, if we, you know, are doing this full time, we can make our own schedules and do what works for us. You know, I find that I don't do well taking breaks. I like to get in and I like to work and I like to push my brain until it's done, and then I like to be done. Mm-hmm. Whereas you, Dan, you're like, nope, I need to take a break. I need a nap. And like, that's so awesome that you know that about yourself. And I would really encourage all authors and just creatives who are listening to this, figure out what works for you. And don't be afraid if that doesn't, you know, meet the regular standards, or, you know, if you're not the author who likes to sit in a coffee shop and write. You know, I was not the person who liked to go to the library to work or sit in a coffee shop to write. To me, it was very distracting. I need to be home in my little office or, you know, in a corner of my bedroom, wherever, but I need to be home to do my best work. So I think that's super important. Just like know who you are.
Love it.
So one of the things that you did mention, though, was podcasts. So the last question I want to talk about is, are there any favorite resources that you have that you would like to kind of pimp out there?
You know, it's funny. You'd sent ahead a couple questions, and this was the last one. And I really thought about like what my honest answer was, and I knew what you're going with it. But the thing I've been thinking about all day is probably different than you intend, but it's my very honest answer. When I think of how can you learn about what you should be doing differently, finding examples, two things I think about are watch what people do, not what they say. This has been a practice of mine for years now, especially around marketing, where you'll find a lot of people who will be selling you something. And usually that if the person is selling it, it means that they're successful at that thing. You know, I have been successful by my thing that shows you how to be successful. And then they'll tell you about the thing. What I often find, if you just watch how they share their message, what they do, you often learn not what they were doing 2 or 3 years ago. You'll learn what they're doing right now. You learn what they're trying, what they think is effective. And there's so much to learn from that. I've gone through a lot of exercises myself where I will watch someone do that, and I'll create a deck. I'll create a whole PowerPoint saying, they did this. They did this. Here was their calendar. Here's the message I received. This is what happened after. This is what their cart looked like. And you start really dissecting what people do and instead of what they say. And I think that can be important in a lot of ways. Even very practical things when someone says, oh, I'm doing my first book reading. What should I do? And it's like, go on YouTube, find some authors you respect, watch when people have done their little iPhone thing where they've recorded it, and watch what they do. You can read blog posts about it, but you'll drive yourself nuts with all the to-dos. Watch someone you respect and then map it out. Oh, they told a joke, and then they didn't start with the reading, they started with a story, and it was a story about this, and you start figuring out what it looks like. The other piece of advice here would be to look outside of your industry. And this is another one where there are amazing, great podcasts and books for authors, and so many people I love in this industry.
Yep.
But I find some of the more interesting ways to think about your work that feel fresh is when you're not the 1,000th person who's a romance author doing this thing that all the other romance authors are doing. It's not there's anything bad with that, but sometimes it can feel like you're always a day late and a penny short because everyone else is doing it. Yeah. And when you look a little more broadly, when you look at what musicians are doing, what artists are doing, what other marketers under other industries are doing, and you translate that, you say, yeah, wow, I was on this incredible, if we go back to podcasts, like I just discovered recently Joe Rogan, who's like a comic who has this very popular podcast. You can say, wow, like I noticed this guy's a stand-up comic and he does a podcast like this, or he does this funny, weird thing on Twitter. And you start thinking, what would that look like in the romance author area? Like, what would that be if I used him as a model because people, it was so fresh. For him, his podcasts are like 3 hours long. They're so deep.
Yeah.
Or just outside of your industry, and you realize that there's so much to learn by so many creative people that aren't just in this very narrow field. And some of the most interesting, again, I'll go back to the word fulfilling ideas are going to come from that. See what inspires you, and then deconstruct that and think, how can you bring that into your work? So
I love that. I think that's even better than just like, here's some resources, like go for it. So like one, kind of like watching other people, it almost reminds me of like people watching. It's like one of those things that a lot of authors will do. Like if you watch people and see what they do, you can write more authentic characters. So it's kind of the same idea with looking at, okay, what are these people doing to promote their books? And is that something that I should try? One of the things that I talk about a lot with authors, especially when we talk about, the big book launch, you can try all kinds of different things, especially for self-publishing. You have that ability, so the book's going to be there. Like you're saying, I have the book on Amazon right now. Eventually I can bring it wide. But with the internet, there is no shelf life to that book anymore. Like it's there, it's out. So I can try different things. If this launch doesn't go great, I can do, change the cover and do a whole nother reveal if I want to and just change. So I love that idea of just, seeing what people are doing and seeing if that's something that would work or would be worth trying.
right.
And then looking outside your industry. So like one of my favorite podcasts was the new Rainmaker podcast by Rainmaker Digital, right? That is not a publishing related podcast. It's a marketing related podcast, but it was fascinating. I was like, this is stuff that I've been trying to teach authors that is being taught to like your general marketing information. So I love that we can learn from like different industries. I would caution that we do want to make sure that we're not making something completely different. If we're a romance author, we want to have our cover be like totally not in relation with other romance authors. Like you do want to kind of be aware of what's expected, but
yes.
Don't be afraid to try things new. I think that's what Dan's overall point is, and I really love that. So thank you so much for being here, Dan. I'll be including all your information about the book and stuff below, and some information about the courses that are upcoming, because I think they're going to go hand in hand. And I am super excited. I pre-ordered my 10 copies, and I'm waiting for them to show up at my door to pass them around.
Thank you so much.
All right.